So hi everyone, my name is Scott, and I'm a visiting researcher here, as you just heard about. Tonight I'm going to be sharing some of the preliminary results from the first 6 months of my PhD research that I've been doing here in Nuuk. I'm about halfway through my project, so these are some of my initial results, initial thoughts, and these will be much more elaborated in later versions of this. Before jumping into it, I just want to take a moment to thank a few people. So first off, Ebba and everyone at the university, all the faculty and staff here that have helped me get here and kind of get into the community. Everyone at the Nature Institute and at ASIAC who've given me their time and sort of let me hang out with them and harass them over the last several months. My friends and sort of surrogate family in Nuuk who've been real sources of support for me over the last several months, and there have been some big ups and downs in that time. And of course, all the funders and the mentors from my home university who have made it possible for me to actually come here. Oh, and this is a climate monitoring station that some of you probably recognize nearby the city. So I'm going to give you just a overview, a roadmap of where we're going to go tonight. So first of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am, the motivation behind my work, and I'm going to tell you some about the work that I've done in Greenland since 2017. I'm going to kind of position my work within the discipline of anthropology in a broad way and give you a bit of a sense of who I am. I'm going to tell you about what I've been doing since I got here in the fall, so my current research trip, and where I'll be going after I depart from Nuuk in just a week. I'll tell you a little bit about some of the context and events that are shaping my research and some of the perspectives going into my study. And in the next section of my talk, I'm going to talk about some of the key themes that have been emerging from my interviews and from my participant observation. And I'm going to discuss how issues related to Greenland's cultural history sort of shape science and the perception of scientists, and how issues of language emerge as roadblocks in scientific communication and collaboration. I'm also going to talk about some of the understandings and I think misunderstandings about the Arctic that impact how especially US researchers understand Greenland. And I'm going to talk about some of the main differences that I've noticed between the two research communities that have made up a major part of my research up to this point. And finally, I'm going to touch on some of the brief practical suggestions coming out of my project. So these are sort of going to focus on how to strengthen scientific collaboration between groups of researchers and also improve outreach and communicating science to the public. Oh, that's the wrong key. So we're having some technical issues. Okay, here we go. So I'm coming from Emory University, which is a large research university in Atlanta, Georgia. So that's in the southeastern part of the States. And I'm working on my PhD in anthropology, which is a discipline in the social sciences that's really interested in the study of humans from all different kinds of angles. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, which means that I'm interested in understanding sort of human culture and society and how societal processes, large processes, unfold on a day-to-day level and how we kind of make these big processes we talk about through our everyday action. And so within anthropology, I'm actually really interested in understanding science and how scientific practice and producing knowledge about the world is shaped by cultural norms and history. So since the 1970s, there's been a growing recognition within anthropology and sort of allied social sciences that science is not just a practice that discovers facts about the world. It's a human endeavor done by people with all the perspectives and histories that researchers bring to the table when they're doing their work. So looking at the day-to-day of how science functions can really help us better understand knowledge, or can understand how knowledge about the world is made. And this is especially important to understand, I think, when we think about climate change, because it's a sort of globally defined issue that's bringing people from all sorts of cultures together, and in Greenland, bringing people from all over the world together to study this sort of set of phenomena. It is one disclaimer I do want to put out here, is that I do think science is real. I think sometimes when you give a talk like this, people think you're just saying everything is made up. That's not what I'm saying. The scientific method is great. It's very helpful for learning about the world. But data aren't made in a vacuum, and so I think it's really important to understand the context and history that go into producing knowledge, especially knowledge that we sort of claim is neutral and above the fray of culture and history. So I'm really trying to argue that we need to understand science itself as a culturally located and historically located process. So oftentimes people will talk about indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge and be very upfront about how that's cultural, but we don't really do that with science, and so I'm arguing that we should do that more. My project is also contributing to conversations about what I'm calling contemporary Arctic life and climate change. And so through my project, I'm quite interested in representing the Arctic as a sort of globalized and urbanizing place that's really highly connected to many parts of the world. Oftentimes it's sort of seen in isolation, just as a pan-Arctic region, and so I'm trying to draw out some of the diversity of the region and also complement social science literature, especially about Greenland, which often focuses on rural and more traditional aspects of Arctic life. And I want to be clear that I'm not focusing on all of Greenland in my project, and my work mostly revolves around perspectives from Nuuk. And I know Nuuk is quite different from many parts of the country, and that the perspectives about science and futures and climate change that are resonant in Nuuk have excuse me, are likely to be quite different than someone in Qaanaaq or Nursarsuaq, and especially in an area where people's livelihoods are already being very heavily impacted by environmental change. So I'm talking about a specific set of people and perspectives, but I think it's important because a part of my project is what we call in anthropology studying up. And that means that rather than sort of focusing on marginalized communities or people in quite rural communities, which is a long-term tradition in anthropology and across social sciences, studying up means that you're sort of studying people at the center of power or at the height of authority in a culture. And there have been many fewer studies studying up, but I think that doing that work is important so that we can really get a full picture of how the social world is working and not only look at marginalized communities to better understand how the world works. So I started coming to Greenland in 2017. I had been studying issues related to climate change and futures in Maine in the northeastern United States, which is being heavily affected by what's happening in Greenland. And so in my PhD, having spent a lot of time in Maine, I decided to start coming to Greenland to see what was happening. And I just got increasingly interested. So I worked in 2017 as a researcher for Greenland Perspective, and then I returned in 2018 to continue the pilot research for the project that I'm doing now. I was working again in Nuuk, and then in Kangerlussuaq and in Sisimiut, where I was embedded with an American climate science team, and I worked with them as a field assistant traveling around collecting climate change data. And this really allowed me and that experience to understand and experience what Americans are kind of doing in the field when they come here and how they understand and think about Greenland and also how they interact or usually do not interact with people that live here. So I was really struck by the intense sense of isolation as well as the really low amount of knowledge that researchers from the States coming here had about Greenland outside of the really specific maybe research area or just processes that they were looking at. So well over 300 researchers from the States come here every summer in order to study climate change and do natural science work. There's really surprisingly low contact between that group as well as the researchers and the research community in Nuuk. People usually just don't come here. So as I was doing this work and kind of looking at these two sides of climate science in Greenland, I really began to understand a major difference between the American and the Greenland-based researchers that I was getting to know. And while folks from the States repeatedly mentioned the climate apocalypse to me and audibly wondered about the future of the country and the future of the landscape as we worked outside to collect data, people that I met in Nuuk and I was getting to know here, both scientists and non-scientists, just didn't seem that bothered. And it's not that anyone was particularly hyped about or really excited about climate change, although I did meet a couple people like that. But it was more that there was just a decided air of detachment and neutrality. It's good and bad, people kept telling me. They sounded almost like anthropologists. They kept saying it was complicated. So And the 2 years of work led me to recognize the main issue that I've been thinking about in my research, which I've boiled down here to hopefully a somewhat effective sentence. But basically, there's sort of two groups of researchers trying to understand the local and global effects that climate change happening in Greenland is going to have, while not really talking to each other. And there's something, a sort of set of processes that are being framed as a global challenge that's being studied with quite similar methods in similar, although not necessarily overlapping, field sites. But this is actually, at the end of the day, producing two really different kind of climate changes. One is a climate change object that's quite apocalyptic, that this is the beginning of what the end of the world looks like. You know, just look outside, you can see it. And one is a climate change that's much more mundane, with a mix of local effects, and maybe it's not even happening, because that's something that we'll talk about later. So obviously, it seemed to me that there was more than just the production of pure knowledge about the world going on here, and I became increasingly interested in understanding how climate and environmental science works here, and how it's sort of embedded in culture here. And the more I learned about the history of Arctic science, and the more I became interested in understanding the relationships between researchers and researchers in the public, this really helped me develop some research questions that have been at the heart of my study. And so, as many of you know, because I've interviewed a bunch of you that are in this room, these are some of the questions that I'm asking. So, what do US and Greenland-based researchers do when studying the environment and the climate? Basically, what does the day-to-day of this work look like? How do we go from getting a sample to being able to make a claim about the global climate? How do they communicate with one another, and how do they communicate with the public? And then also, how do members of the public perceive scientists and science? This was something that came up again and again, and some of the frictions around that I'll be talking about. And then finally, how do researchers think about the future of Greenland, and how do they contextualize their work in the sort of contemporary politics and understandings of the future that are attached to and happening in Greenland? So to do this work and pursue these questions, I've been doing two main methods, which are sort of the mainstays of anthropology. So that's participant observation and sort of long-form ethnographic interviews. So participant observation means spending time with people. So you're working with people, you're seeing what they do, and you're sort of being helpful and doing what you can do to give back to everyone who's giving you your time. So this method really involves being open and honest and interactive. So you're not just spying on people or watching them from a corner and writing down what they do. I think that's a misperception sometimes. But what you're really doing is experiencing as best you can the daily rhythms of the life in a group, so that you can better understand how they see and experience the world. And then interviews allow you to have sort of more focused conversations and really explore some of your questions in depth. And so for me, in being in Greenland over the last 6 months, but also over the last several years, this has meant a few things. It often means working as a field assistant, because a skill that I have is being able to carry heavy things. But doing that with folks from the Greenland Ecological Monitoring Program, assisting with some projects at ASIAC, accompanying researchers from the Greenland Climate Research Center on marine sampling trips, and also attending all the public outreach events related to science that have been going on in Nuuk since the time that I have been here. I also worked as an organizer for Greenland Science Week, helping work on the science cinema. And I've also, to date, completed 37 focused long-form interviews with non-scientists and then Greenland-based and US researchers, and each of those are about an hour long. And I want to say that my work and what I'm doing is only one project thinking about collaboration and communication in science. So there is a kind of push to build better relationships between the US and Greenlandic community. But I'm trying to get an actual ethnographic or kind of day-to-day view on how those processes look. Because usually people get together for a day or 2 days at a conference to talk about how great collaboration is, and then they leave and they might not talk for a year. So I'm trying to fill in some of the gaps in what happens in that time. So you can see I've been in Nuuk for the most part since September to March. I'm going back to the States next week, where I'll be if my flights are not all grounded because of coronavirus, I'll be visiting a bunch of climate research centers across the states. And then I'll be coming back to Greenland in June, and I'll be living at KISS up in Kangerlussuaq, and then I'll be coming back to Nuuk briefly in the summer as well. And I've been really happy to be here. Well, not so happy about this, but we'll talk about it. Because there's just been a lot going on that started happening around the same time as my research project as I started to come here. So I want to talk about a few of these just to give you a sense of what I'm thinking about. So first of all is the contemporary and sort of historical interest in the US. So the US has been present in Greenland for a really long time. You know, people think back to the presence in World War II. It also goes back further than that. But right before I came to the field, like that I came to Nuuk, President Trump made his surprise and now somewhat infamous announcement that he was going to buy Greenland. And you can see the public relations for this. I don't know if anyone was at this event, but this Trump mascot was chased off stage by a shaman and a group of Tupilak, who then all removed their heads and sung the Greenlandic national anthem. So I think people here have some feelings about it as well. And so, well, this was obviously a huge public circus. This is also just one instance where the kind of increasing US interest in Greenland becomes visible. And there are a lot of things driving that interest, and I think a lot of them are related to climate change and environmental futures. So some of that interest in Greenland from the States is about the big effects that Greenlandic melt, the disappearance of Sumerswak, is going to have on the eastern seaboard and just to oceans in general. The United States is also quite interesting in increasing its access to rare earth minerals and sources from outside of China, as well as interest in sort of future shipping routes and oil access that might be coming in the future. There's also a fair amount of anti-Russia and anti-China maneuvering happening in the background. And science and scientific cooperation are just one part of this puzzle, but they also kind of flow through this. Because better understanding the sort of physical processes and changes that are happening in Greenland is actually quite connected to the US's future interest and presence here. And science is also a way, the newspapers are calling it the US charm offensive, but it's a way for US presence and US money to continue entering Greenland in a very friendly and sort of non-threatening, and honestly, oftentimes a very positive way. And at the same time, efforts on the sort of Greenlandic side of things are being made to make science more accessible to the public and have it play more of a larger role and visible role in society. So some things that happened while I was here were Greenland Science Week. That was a really big one. That was moving an Arctic Studies conference from Copenhagen to Nuuk for the first time. There's also Natur om Tors Day, as some of you have been to over at the Nature Institute. Culture Night and the science education program that's happening. And also discussions about creating an Arctic science hub. So that's an idea to create a sort of institute, clearinghouse, to better connect researchers and communities in Greenland. And the Greenland Greenland Research Council, is also working on a new research policy that will be coming out sometime this year or the beginning of next year. And there have also been, as I mentioned, these conferences about US-Greenlandic collaboration. In 2018, there was one in Nuuk, and in 2019, there was one in Washington, DC. So all in all, I felt lucky to be here at this time and to get to see and participate in some of the major steps that are being taken to, first of all, center Greenlandic priorities in research. So the sort of increasing awareness that there needs to be some regulation around how research works here. As one of my interlocutors put it to me, no country would give away its oil for free, so why should we be giving away knowledge about our environment and our environment to other people for free? So it's clear that there's an interest in kind of having Greenlandic control and more sort of Greenlandic oversight of the research that's happening here. And at the same time, I think we're starting to see the very first steps in kind of decolonizing research. And in the way that I'm using that here, to me, that means right now sort of making research for and by Greenlanders and trying to find ways to make it more applicable and more meaningful in everyday people's lives. I think whether or not or how much that's actually happening is really up for debate. Among academics, when we talk about decolonizing research, often what we're talking about is changing the norms, methods, and what we take for granted about academic research, such that old power structures and forms of hierarchy that we take for granted are slowly dismantled, and that underrepresented voices and underrepresented modes of academic representation are being welcomed into conversations. And so I think by that standard, there's still a really long way to go, especially in the natural science world here. But it does seem like there's some sort of organic and exciting conversations starting to happen, especially among the students at Ilisimatusarfik. And so I'm quite interested to see where that kind of goes and how that continues to develop. But even as these steps are being taken to make science a more integral part of Greenlandic society and to, do this work that I'm talking about, I think science is also still very affected by things that other social dynamics that are happening in the country. So there are these kind of misunderstandings and shaping of how science works that I think are worth looking at a little bit if we're going to try to really understand what's happening and really change some of it. So that's where I get into some of the themes that I want to talk about tonight. So colonialism, language, and Arctic imaginations. So a theme that's emerged again and again in the interviews and casual conversations, as well as just being in Greenland that has come up, are things that related to colonialism and how the continued legacies of colonialism are shaping and affecting science and understandings of science in Greenland. So historically, when we look at it, science and research in and about Greenland has been very linked to claims of Danish sovereignty over the island. Scientific activity was one of the things on the East Coast that helped get control of it back from Norway, and this is sort of an ongoing thing. So science and politics have been linked here for a long time. And as well as for foreign countries like the US, France, and Germany have all used science as an excuse to have a presence in Greenland, even if that's just on and right around the ice sheet. And so even though Greenland has home rule, the sort of former political status that started in 2009, as everyone here knows, does not mean that 300 years of colonization just kind of disappears overnight. And the sort of histories and effects that the colonization and modernization of Greenland in the 1950s had are ongoing and are something that people are continuing to process and think about from a variety of different perspectives. And coming out of that 2008 NSF conference that was held in Nuuk, in their report they mentioned colonialism 2 times, and only once to indicate that it at all plays any role in contemporary Greenlandic life. They say that Greenland is still emerging from its colonial past, and they don't elaborate on it at all. So I was not, when I first came here in 2017, expecting that dynamic to really be part of my research, but it's come up again and again, and it's been something that I've been investigating, especially more formally on this trip. So I want to be clear, perfectly clear to say when I'm talking about colonialism, that I'm not raising this issue to point the finger at anyone or to place blame for how things are working. I don't think that there's an evil person kind of hiding somewhere behind the scenes, pulling the strings and really trying to oppress people, and that's not the point of talking about this. The idea, rather, is to sort of start excavating how histories inherited from the past continue to shape the present. And in shedding light on them and in naming them as real, I hope that we can begin to deal with them in new ways and at least making thinking about the ties between colonialism and research part of a public conversation, which in my experience it often is not, although it comes up in private conversations. So the first way that this has come up, or the way that this connection starts being made, is really a rhetorical question when it comes to thinking about science and research in Greenland. And that's the question of who is doing research and for whom. So many people have described to me that research is a mostly Danish or a kind of globalized and foreign affair, that it seems removed from their day-to-day lives, and there's a certain amount of suspicion from what one person called the Danes on the hill outside of the city, and their motivations for doing the work that they do here. So this is a really broad generalization that people make, obviously, and it demonstrates a dynamic where researchers are generally lumped together into one group and painted in opposition to Greenlandic people and Greenlandic interests. And I think that this often goes back to controversy around resource management advice and hunting and fishing quotas, sort of friction around how to use the resources in Greenland. Because the researchers that I've been working with are really not involved in creating that kind of advice for the government, but people are sort of still lumped together when you say that you're thinking about and talking to scientists. And at the same time, I think it's really easy to dismiss this kind of lumping as just an instance of anti-Danish sentiment held by non-experts that don't know what's going on. And people often do that, but I think that it's a mistake to go too far in either one of these directions. And what we need to do is start looking at why people are making this critique and making a connection between colonialism and science in the first place. And while I think that there's a lot connected to just history, language, and even the infrastructure that makes science work here, what it also comes back to again and again are questions about who the researchers are and what's really happening to the knowledge that they produce about Greenland, hence the question that I articulated. So when you look at the community of environmental and climate researchers in Greenland, people are usually not Greenlandic. And the long-term history of education in Greenland has meant that few people from Greenland are sort of qualified and really trained to have positions as researchers. And while I think that this is changing as more science education is being introduced, both through the Arctic Science Partnership at the Nature Institute, as well as plans here at the university, right now the majority of folks working in research capacities are either from Denmark or other European countries. And that's not to say that there are not Greenlandic people involved in the research apparatus. There completely are. And I've talked to most of them, and they're usually lab assistants or secretaries or people that are kind of making the logistics work. And so even though there are sort of Greenlandic voices, Greenlandic people present, you also still really see a kind of hierarchy between who is operating sort of at the peak of this infrastructure that we have and people that are kind of the support, which really mimics a sort of long historical trend in how employment in Greenland works. And also, the data that are collected regarding climate and environmental change are not used by the government of Greenland, and their value to everyday people honestly seems unclear a lot of the time. So since so much of the thinking and research about climate change involves these long temporal scales in these remote areas of the country that are often actually quite removed from where people live, it's often unclear why climate science matters. And I do think that it's also up in the air how clearly articulated the reason that climate science matters has been by the people doing the research. And so, while across the board, you often see the idea that research is helpful to Greenlandic society, when you ask people to articulate who Greenlandic society actually is, you get a completely different answer from almost everyone that's involved. So sometimes you hear that it's the government, sometimes you hear it's fishermen, sometimes you hear it's everyone, and sometimes you hear it's actually not helpful at all. So the use of this data and this science, I think, is unclear for people day to day. And there are a lot of good reasons for why climate science matters in society. People are working on projects that involve natural hazard forecasting and trying to stop things like the tsunami that we saw in North Greenland a couple years ago. And also things related to infrastructure, construction, permafrost melt. These are all quite important, but these are not things that people generally think about on a day-to-day. But the data is also exported usually. So most of the data that's produced through the Greenland Ecological Monitoring Program, for example, is put into an online database that is accessible to anyone, but is mostly utilized by foreign researchers. And in my interviews with scientists, people often acknowledge that most of the material they produce regarding climate change is sort of put into foreign journals, is exported out of the country, and they don't really have a clear sense of who in Greenland is looking at it, how it gets back to the country, and almost none of it is translated into Greenlandic. And they also said that one reason for this is that the government of Greenland is not interested in data about climate change. And in my work and interviews with people from Nalakersuisut, this sort of seems to be the case. And so they told me, for example, that most of the data that you would see in something like the Climate Greenland portal is not actually from research that's done by people in Greenland. This is Danish or other foreign researchers writing about the country that they use. And so the government's interest in climate change as it sort of exists so far seems pretty limited to sort of highly practical applications with very immediate consequences, and not the longer term research and basic science that a lot of people are interested in doing in Greenland. The government also isn't funding it, and so that means that almost all the research funding for climate change is coming from either Danish foundations or from the States. And so, while I think it's unfair to paint all scientists with a broad brush and say that they're anti-Greenlandic, because I know from experience that they are not, I think when you take a step back and you kind of look at this from one level up, the connections to colonialism that people make start to make a little more sense. If you start to see science as a largely extractive practice done by people not from Greenland, with little to no use for people in Greenland or any articulated benefits, it's a little bit clearer to see why people might make that jump, and we don't just have to dismiss it as a, oh, everyone is really racist to each other, which is often what one version of how this story is told. But more than that, I think one thing that's been pretty interesting in my interviews is that something that comes down to a perceived lack of contextual knowledge held about Greenland by people that are here doing research. And this is true for domestic researchers, where people say that people that are domestic researchers don't know anything, and it's doubly true for people from the States. And I will say that I think that critique is a little more fair towards people from the States, or rather just very true about people from the States. But this is basically boiled down to a frustration and a kind of request that researchers learn more about Greenland, that they acknowledge the colonial history of Greenland, the culture of Greenland, and how people in Greenland sort of think and how they think about the past. And to say, oh, how people think about the past, that's actually hard to generalize, because in all of my data collection, people's opinions on the past are sort of different. But the request that researchers learn more about the country and acknowledge their positionality in regard to its history and society is generally the same across my sample so far. So basically, acknowledge history, acknowledge your identity and the baggage that comes with being a foreign researcher in Greenland, and also just try to learn a little bit more about the country and the place that you're working. And when I mention this idea to my domestic interlocutors, I get a wide range of responses. So some people acknowledge that science and colonialism are linked to each other, and some are even sympathetic to this critique in an intellectual sense. Others say that they've never thought about it before, and some people pretty vehemently disagree with me, and then we have a conversation about it. But one thing that's also been pretty consistent in the conversations I've had is a statement that goes along the lines of something like this. Well, everybody hates scientists all over the world. They're always scapegoats. And this isn't really wrong. So as people involved in conservation know, especially often given their role in telling people not to hunt or fish or to cut down a forest or whatever it is to use resources, scientists in many parts of the world are often villainized, used as a political punching bag, and there are tensions between sort of expert and non-expert communities. So seeing that happen in Greenland is not new or particularly notable. But I think what has been interesting to me is to actually think for a moment about the move that's made when or local logistics support. So rather than being a partner in knowledge creation, you're really subordinated to the role of just a Greenlandic partner whose knowledge about the country, its norms, and how to get things done are really the only contribution you can make. And this is especially a problem, and it puts people in a bind when their contextual knowledge about Greenland might actually be extremely low. So if you moved here 6 months ago and you're all of a sudden a Greenlandic partner in an international collaboration, you might actually be quite hobbled in doing that job and in doing it well. And the other part that this comes up is just the idea of what I'm calling history and the second-rate researcher. So this is to say that there's still some issues between Greenland and Denmark that are really being hashed out, and some power plays that come up within the scientific world. So once again, this goes back to the idea that life in Greenland is generally slower pace and less competitive compared to a global research center like Copenhagen. And therefore, your work that's done here is of lower quality, and people have expressed a sense of frustration that their data might not be trusted or that it might be routinely dismissed in exchange for data collected by a Dane or a large Danish institution in Greenland rather than what's being done here. And one interviewee told me a story where a researcher from Denmark was demanding more support be given to his project from the government of Greenland. To do this large natural science project here. And as he put it, it's not your money anyway. Basically implying that the money coming from the Greenlandic government was actually Danish because it originated in the block grant rather than being in control of someone in Greenland. And while I don't think that I think this is an extreme example, and I've only heard this kind of story once, I do think that it resonates with something that I've heard again and again, which is that there seems to be a sense of ownership and a kind of colonial attitude, as people have told it to me, about some of the large research organizations from Denmark that have historically done and continue to do work here. And this makes the kind of autonomy of Greenland and the role of Greenland and its place in the hierarchy in the Kingdom of Denmark one that kind of gets played up and brought back into debate rather than being taken for granted that Greenland might be on equal footing with Denmark. But more than colonialism, what is often comes up in almost everything I do is language. And so the language choice that people use when communicating science really matters. But as most of the scientific community here does not speak Greenlandic, it's rarely used as the default language for sharing data or findings. And tonight is a good example of that. This is happening in English, right? So there is outreach being done on Facebook in Greenlandic, and there are translation services often available at public outreach events like Greenland Science Week or Natur om Torsdag. But people often express to me that Greenlandic is still not used enough, that it still really feels, okay, I don't know what's going on with this microphone, that it still really feels like a second priority, but should actually be the first language used by researchers, especially when they're doing outreach. And the lack of Greenlandic usage can really alienate people. And I had a few interviews about the experience of folks at Greenland Science Week who really communicated this to me well. So on the one hand, it's really great to be at an Arctic Studies conference because it's the first time that all this knowledge being produced about Greenland is actually being showcased in Greenland. But at the same time, because there were so few Greenlandic participants and so little of the events actually took place in Greenlandic, people often also said that it felt kind of alienating, that it felt like a conference about Greenland, not for or by people from the country. So still this sort of feeling of objectification. And so the lack of Greenlandic use in science, I think furthers the feeling that this is sort of a foreign endeavor that just happens to take place in the country. But the demand for Greenlandic use, I think, is much easier to make than it is to actually implement. So we can make this critique, but how does it actually work? It's easy to say things, what do you do? So one reason that it's not used, according to a lot of the people I've interviewed, is that English is the international language of science. As a sort of transnational practice that moves across a lot of borders, English is just the lingua franca, and that's how it works. And it allows people like me and other first English speakers in the room to come and work here, and for events like Greenland Science Week to really take place. And so as a global language, people also say that English use can help make Greenland more cosmopolitan and more international. And since most of the researchers working here speak Danish and English, they're more comfortable using those or slipping into English anyway. And among the English-only or English-first researchers that I know who've moved here, they actually end up being much more likely to take Danish classes rather than Greenlandic classes because Danish is the working language of the institutions where they end up having jobs. So while there's a lot of goodwill and the idea that people should learn Greenlandic, that often ends up not being a practical choice for people that want to be involved in the research community here. And the other part of this, and the last part, really comes down to just issues of resources and capacity around translation, and I mean research more broadly, but translation especially. And simply put, there's not really enough money to translate everything into Greenlandic. And so people really have to make choices about how those limited resources should be used. And this becomes a tension where you have to decide what you translate and what you don't, knowing in some way that every choice that comes with that translation choice is also a choice about exclusion and who can participate in something and who can't. But people just have to make that choice because there are not that many translators and it's quite expensive. And you might think that a group like NSF and all of their millions and millions of dollars would be a good answer for this, but they occupy a kind of weird middle zone. Because well, on the one hand, they're quite happy to put forward some funding for translation or it costs in a grant proposal. They're also unwilling to fund basic language learning or basic language learning, for their researchers, which they described in a conference on Greenlandic US research collaborations in September of 2019. So they're happy to, talk about how great Greenlandic is, but the unwillingness to put their money where their mouth is, quite literally in this case, is still really a problem, and I don't think it's one that's going to go away very soon. And the last dynamic that has come up in my research when we think about the Arctic and what people are doing here is the idea of kind of Arctic imaginations and misunderstandings about what the Arctic is. So when I mentioned a lack of contextual knowledge, I wasn't just talking about the sort of chronological or cultural history of Greenland. I was also talking, I think on a more general level, about an understanding of the reality of what the Arctic is and what it isn't. And as scholars across Arctic studies have argued, and as there was a conference about in this room in October, the Arctic is a world region that's often sort of misunderstood and romanticized by people who are not from here, and is shaped by imaginations that are produced in art, in literature, and oftentimes today in media about Greenland and international media. So we know what these tropes are. So Greenland is empty, it's ruled by nature, this is a frontier lacking in civilization, this is the far reaches of the world, and even the Arctic itself goes back to the Greek of sort of the end of the farthest north you can go, And those narratives, as we know, silence the voice of people in Greenland, they silence indigenous history, land use, and cosmology, but people still really turn to these Arctic imaginations when they come here. And I think that this is very true among the US research community and kind of going to the frontier and what that expedition, which is the language used to talk about science here, looks like. So I'm just going to tell you about a few ways that I've seen this play out. So one is in my own observations working as a field assistant in Kangerlussuaq. And the idea that we were in a highly wild and remote and even dangerous area was baked into the way that US scientists talked about where they were, as well as the daily practices of administering the Kangerlussuaq International Science Support Center, or KISS. And a lot of us have been stranded in Kangerlussuaq or been there due to air travel, and you've walked around it. It does not seem particularly wild or particularly dangerous. And is really the most accessible part of the entire country of Greenland, but that's not how you're supposed to think about it as an American scientist. So if you leave KISS and you walk in any direction aside from sort of towards the airport, you're actually asked to register with the research station staff so that they can track you down and make sure that you haven't fallen into a crevasse or some other, been eaten by a polar bear. And people often talk to me about what it felt like to be an explorer, what it felt like to be out in the wild while they were in Kangerlussuaq, and what it felt like to have the National Geographic theme song playing in your head as you got to go out to one of your field sites to collect data. So there is this sense of really being somewhere wild and remote, even as you have the biggest airport in the country. And just as an aside, one interesting difference that I've learned is that even though Kangerlussuaq is maybe the most dangerous place on Earth, American scientists are not given rifles or any sort of shooting courses, which is mandatory for researchers here if you're going to be in an area that has polar bears or muskox. And so despite how wild it is, you have really no defenses against nature while you're there. And so this idea, combined with just the fact that most people don't come to Nuuk, are often in remote field sites, I think continues to maintain this image of Greenland as quite a wild place. And people were quite surprised to learn that Nuuk is a city, much less a city with a university or anything else. And I think that the understandings that Americans especially have about Greenland are mediated by images of the country and images of climate change. So basically, representations of climate change and who it's affecting in Greenland really shape how people understand the country. And so if humans are discussed in relation to climate change at all, and attention is given to something other than a polar bear or a melting glacier or an iceberg, the image of Greenland that you see in foreign media, and especially media in the US, I would argue, is one that's sort of stuck in the past and very fixated on the highly traditional. So it will likely have more to do with hunting or ice loss in a remote settlement in the north than it will something like people's worries about access to education, healthcare, or even sort of more mundane things like people's feelings about handball or football championships. And these do pop up every once in a while, and it does make sense that you would do a story about how hunting is affected by climate change in North Greenland. So it's not, once again, the intent is not there, but this is just what happens. And so, well, in Greenland, the perspective is often that too much attention is given to Nuuk and the goings-on and thoughts and opinions about people here. The second you leave and are in a sort of more foreign community in Greenland, people don't even know what's happening here at all. And so what foreign researchers often have to represent Greenland, and what they then will maybe use in public presentations, are images like this one here, which I'm sure you've all seen, which was tweeted by a researcher working from DMI in North Greenland near Qanuq last summer. And I'm choosing this photo to include in my presentation specifically because it's been brought up to me so many times since I've been here, and about the hubbub that it kind of caused by going viral. And as one person put it to me, this photo synthesizes everything that foreign people know about Greenland into one photo. There's climate change and there's dog sledging. So it's been repeatedly explained to me, though, by researchers here that they, were really sort of flooded with attention and flooded with what's happening from press abroad, but that there's a problem, which is that it's not particularly unexpected to see melt like this in a fjord in Qanuq in mid-June. And this is not to say that, there's not changes in the environment happening there, but that this image gives a different sense about what's happening in Greenland than what people here often take for granted. And that the attention to people from abroad was quite overblown. But for scientists from the States, I think this photo really resonates with ideas about the slow-moving climate apocalypse happening in Greenland that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. And this brings me into some of the major differences in how Greenland has been explained to me, and some of the major differences in the values attached to climate change among the two research communities I've been immersed in. So in the States, Greenland has been described to me as a ticking time bomb. I've been told that millions of lives are at stake in understanding snow compaction in Greenland. And when you're out in the field with people, people are very ready and willing to point at waterfalls coming off the edge of the ice sheet. Or I was near Point 660 last summer, and the bridge got briefly flooded out, and this was the thing, we're finally seeing it, even though the bridge washes out at least once a year, according to people I talked to in Kongresslusuaq. And it's even actually, I think, this sense of panic and global doom, this affect of panic is getting into how we represent and talk about science in Greenland. So OMG is a huge NASA science project that's happening here to try to understand ice sheet dynamics and what's happening. And so, OMG, it's melting, what are we gonna do? So this sense of panic, I think, really is present in science in many ways. And among researchers here, people really talk to me about how complicated it is. There are good and bad things happening, and more to the point, do we even have enough data to say that climate change is happening? People mention to me again and again that you need about a 30-year data set to be able to make claims about trends that are happening in climate change. And that is technically true. So yeah, from a technical perspective, we don't know if climate change is happening in Greenland or not, so can we make that claim? And bickering about that is not really my interest. It's more to kind of draw out that the almost exact opposite claim that's happening between these two groups of people that are invested in sort of understanding the same set of processes at the same time. And this is something that I'm going to keep talking to people about and I want to keep investigating. But I have sort of two early conclusions to explain some of these differences. So one is the importance of seasonality and the importance of really being here and living in Greenland year-round. And that being here, you know, when you go outside and there's all this snow on the ground, seeing that year after year really does kind of change how you start thinking about what's happening here, as well as having a more awareness of the kind of ambiguous and agnostic feelings that many people in Greenland have about climate change, which for those of you who were here last year and saw Kelton Miners and the Greenland Perspective piece about climate change, about 46% of people here have sort of mixed feelings about it. And so I think being here makes people who work here a little more cautious to make the kind of sweeping statements that you hear coming from people from the States. And this also lines up with some findings about kind of cultural differences in Scandinavian practices of science versus American practices of science. So there's another anthropologist who's done a fair amount of work in Greenland named Martin Skøydstrup, who's Danish but was trained in the States, and he also is interested in science. And he has an article from 2017 talking about climate modeling and differences in how this works in the States and in Denmark based on people's data from Greenland. And so oftentimes what you see is that Scandinavians and Scandinavian science is much more likely to place a big emphasis on kind of these long-term monitoring projects, really being in the field, really seeing those differences, and then using the past and all the past data you've collected as a way to create analogs about the present or the future. So really trying to look back in time to say, explain what might be coming. Whereas Americans, although very busy in building these long climate records using ice cores and paleo lake cores and all these other things, are also very often making huge data sets in order to make kind of climate models and forecasts about the future. So just the kind of practices that people are doing and that they put an emphasis on, I think might also explain some of the differences in these hugely different values that people attach to climate change as a set of processes. And in the last part of my talk, I just want to touch on some of the practical suggestions that are coming out of my project. Because one of the outputs, aside from just my dissertation, is also trying to work to sort of make just some suggestions that I'm gleaning from all my interviews about how how collaboration and communication might work better. So the first one that I put up here is internet and email use among the Greenland-based community. And so email and communication, distant communication, is often described to me as a kind of two-way headache. Nobody really likes it that much. So my sort of Greenland-based informants often tell me that they're swamped with emails from people that are desperate to come to Greenland to do research or to have a research collaboration here, but that these people, have a really low contextual knowledge about the country, that they need a lot of hand-holding, and that they're asking a lot of what, for people that live here, are considered quite dumb questions, just basic questions about facts. And as one person put it, I'm not Google, you can go look this up yourself. Whether or not you can find all that information on Google, I would say is a little bit debatable. But people just express that this is exhausting, this is a small community, we can't spend all our time doing this email stuff. People in the States, on the other side, get quite frustrated because they say that they can't reach anyone and that they don't know how to get in touch with people and they don't know how to get in touch with the right people. And I think in my experience of being here, that sort of bears it out. I usually have a 2-week, 2-email rule. So I assume that I'm not really going to get anything back within 2 weeks, and not unless there's sort of multiple nudges. That's just what has worked for me, but I think that there is something to that people here are not sort of using email in the way that especially Americans do, but I think we're also kind of obsessed with it a little bit. And so one way to fix this, to try to solve this problem, might be to create, a page, a web page, on the sites that Americans and researchers often find themselves on. So that might be a site that's linked from ASIAC, from GCRC, from GINR, these places where Americans interested in science often sort of stumble into and then start wildly emailing, that might have some FAQs about climate change, like what's actually happening here, because some of those basic facts can actually be quite hard to track down. Some basic info about what people here are looking for in terms of what they want a collaboration to look like. So something more polite than saying, don't bother emailing me if your grant is due in 2 weeks. Or maybe some other avenues that people might reach you, things like this. And also I would say that in terms of the internet use, it's just keeping websites updated. Just trying to make sure that there's up-to-date info that people from abroad can see and engage with, because it gets quite frustrating when you're emailing people whose emails don't exist because they don't work there anymore. You're trying to find these other things, and that's something that's expressed to me a lot. And I know that the Greenland climate portal, for example, that the government has not been updated since January of 2019. So just working on that communication part of it, I think would be good for people here, as well as just doubling down on the research and doing more work if you are coming to Greenland to try to learn as much as you can about the country before you get here. My note about translation is quite similar. This would be just creating a list of people who translate between English and Greenlandic, and maybe some ways to contact them or how much it costs. As you can see, I have a lot of Greenlandic on here, but it took me a long time to find a translator here. I had to talk to a lot of people to get that to work. So I think kind of just making that community a little bit more visible would cut down also on the amount of email harassment about how to work here that you see. Continue to do outreach on KNR, QNR. This is mentioned to me again and again, that really this is the best way to reach people. Facebook is quite good as well, and podcasts. I know some people here are starting to experiment with doing podcasts to communicate their research in science, and based on the conversations I've had, I think that that's a really good direction to keep going in. For US researchers, I want to just say, consider the time that it takes to make a project work here, to build trust, and to actually have a successful project in Greenland. So outreach early. So one thing that I hear a lot is that people get these last-minute things looking for a Greenlandic partner. We need to send our grant in a week. Can you give us a stamp and just say that our project is okay? So don't do that, but also get input from people here, and don't just say that your partner, you're just checking a box about a partnership. And so also outreach more respectfully. So do your due diligence about the people that you're trying to get in touch with. Really spend the hours on Google Translate if something's only available in Danish, and try to understand what's happening in the country. And really get input from folks here. So don't come with a research plan that's completely already done. And you need to be able to let your research questions really be shaped by your time in Greenland. So really respect and use the expertise of the community that's here. And when I say that, I don't just mean researchers, I also mean people outside of the research community, because talking to people that are not researchers is really the best way that you can understand what's going on in Greenland and some of the stuff people are thinking about. And the last thing I want to name, this might be a sort of pie-in-the-sky desire that won't happen anytime soon, but is really a change in just thinking about how do we fund research here? And is there kind of a possibility for a new model of doing that? And so what I'm thinking about is kind of a multi-year grant model, where maybe in the first year of research, someone is just in Greenland starting to develop a project, actually getting community output. One scientist that I interviewed just asked the question, well, what do people want from scientists? We don't actually know. And so if you can have a sort of financial model that allows people to come here and really spend time building a project in conversation with people, I think that we'll actually get projects that are much more helpful, much more understood by people here, and also help ease some of those tensions that I've mentioned again and again. And so with new opportunities being opened up by the increasing money from NSF or what's happening with the Science Hub, I think that there might be some chances to kind of play around and to yeah, play in the sense of really try to experiment with things and figure out what works and what doesn't. So this is an expensive proposition and one that probably won't happen, especially if we're talking to NSF. But I think that if we don't talk about structural change, we are not ever going to make it happen. So thank you so much for your time. I know I've probably gone on a while, but that is me. So thank you.